This week we are discussing culture and communication from Chapter 5 of the Assessment and Treatment of Speech Sound Disorders in Children by dialectical and bilingual considerations. Of course, bi means two, so these are individuals who speak two dialects. One dialect that we speak here in the South, considering you're MUW students, you probably are a speaker of Southern American English, and you are also probably fluent in Standard American English, which is the dialect in which we write. So there are ethnocultural variables in speech sound learning. When we look at children from different cultural backgrounds, including Southerners, we know that there are certain sounds they're going to produce differently because of dialect. So before we begin assessment of these children, we need to know the variations in dialect so that we can not misidentify a dialectical difference as a speech sound disorder. So ethnocultural variations may create language diversity. They are not necessarily limited to immigration or minority status. Again, I myself am a speaker of Southern American English, as you likely are as well as a student, again, in the South. Even within the mainstream culture, language diversity is documented, such as the different dialects of the American English spoken in different parts of the U.S. Verbal diversity of children may increase if at home a dialect or a different language is spoken. So I'm going to pull up a brief video for us to watch about the various dialects of the United States.
You there? Yeah, you were looking for somebody that talks like a Mina.
Have a strong Miami accent. I'm from Owatonna, Minnesota.
And I'm a native Washingtonian.
Alabama.
New York. Brotherville, Texas.
Los Angeles.
Oakland. Albuquerque, Philadelphia. Indiana.
Hohenwald, Tennessee. I've lived in the Chicago area the entire 49 years of my life. So
What is your generic term for a sweet carbonated beverage? That's the soda. Soda. As if it had an orange.
Pop. Coke. What do you call the long sandwich that contains cold cuts, lettuce, and so on? Hebras?
Hoagie. Oh, hoagie. Yeah, that's, Sub?
Yeah, I call it the Subway. I generic. I just do that.
That's a po' boy down here.
A pecan is a nut. Pecan?
Well, in New York it used to be pecan, but in Florida it's pecan.
Okay, I say pecan. 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 Can you say this word B-A-G?
Bag.
Bag.
B-A-G. Bag.
Okay, I say it wrong. Bag. Most people in Minnesota do.
Roly-poly.
A pill bug.
Oh, doodle bug.
Little creatures that roll into a ball.
I don't know what we're talking about. What is that? You mean you're talking about a shrimp?
A U-M-B-R-E-L-L-A?
An umbrella?
Umbrella. What do other people say?
Umbrella.
Umbrella.
What do you call it when the rain falls while the sun is shining?
Sunshine. Sunshine.
I went through 5 of them today.
I'm going to do it. The devil is beating his wife. It's not, I don't really say about it much, but, I always think, oh yeah, the devil's beating his wife whenever I see it happening.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
What's your general term for a rubber-soled shoe worn in gym class?
I would say sneaker. Sneaker.
Them I would call tennis shoes.
Gym shoes?
Root. I know up Midwest there they call it a route.
Route.
A route is when we're beating the other team in basketball by 50 points. That's a route.
And what is your general term for a big road that you drive relatively fast on?
Expressway? Freeway.
I call it a highway.
So I've been trying to say highway on the East Coast. Subway.
Subway.
B-L.
But in D.C. you call it the metro.
Metro.
The T. My mom works for BART, so BART.
Standing in line.
I'm standing in line.
Waiting to get into somewhere.
I'm saying in line.
I'm online.
Online.
What word or words do you use to address a group of 2 or more people?
2 or more people?
Probably, hey, you guys. You guys?
Like, hey guys.
Y'all.
Y'all. Are y'all coming with us?
Y'all come over here.
So if I was in Philly, I'd probably say, hey, yous.
Yous are the best people I know.
called a box you bury a dead person in?
A coffin. A casket.
Okay.
Miracle.
You mean miracle? A miracle? A miracle.
Miracle. Miracle.
Oh, miracles. Yeah, you believe in miracles. Yeah, I do sometimes.
We're all different. Yeah. Go
Yep,
ahead.
I guess so. And this is the last one. What do you call a point that is purely academic or that cannot be settled and isn't worth discussing any further?
Oh, the mute point?
Mute. Oh wait, moot point.
A moot point.
A waste of goddamn time.
So as you can see, there are a variety of dialects spoken across the United States. I myself being from Louisiana originally, I have some dialectical variations that I would not have had if I'd lived in Mississippi all my life, such as I say quarter, sometimes instead of quarter, and caution instead of caution light. So I know those were some individual variations. And of course, you go down to New Orleans and you have the Yat accent, and south of New Orleans and a little bit west, you have the Cajun accent. North of Baton Rouge, you have a Southern American dialect. And within the whole state of Louisiana, you have African American vernacular or dialect. So those are 4 specific dialects spoken in just that one state. So, to assess diverse children, you as a clinician need to know how a child's non-English primary speech and language patterns differ from those of English, how the primary language affects the learning of the second language. So if this was a child who was learning English as a second language, we've traditionally called them English language learners. Now it's possibly English as a second language learners, or just language learners in general. So how to diagnose a speech, sound, and language disorder in the child's first language, the second language, or both. There is a tendency to over-identify children who are from culturally diverse backgrounds or bilingual because they will have English language deficits, but those deficits might be attributable to their native language or their native dialect and not necessarily a true language disorder or speech sound disorder. There are methods for identifying these children through assessment methods called dynamic assessment. This could apply to speech sound disorders, but it's primarily used for children with language disorders and trying to diagnose that. So we won't spend very much time on that, given that this is speech sound disorders are TIC and not language. So we need to know how to prioritize treatment targets for them as well, and to know what needs to be targeted for these children. So African American English, it is a variation of American English. The origin may be a pidgin form of language that developed when people who do not speak the same language interact. So this may have happened in Africa, or when during slavery, when there were various tribes of Africans brought across to the United States and all convening in one area in the South and in plantations, you had mixed dialects on the plantations because everyone didn't share the same language. So they developed this pidgin language mix between the American English being spoken in the South and the languages from their native countries in Africa. So a pidgin develops into a Creole, which is a more complex system of primary communication passed on to children, and this may have happened in North America. So pidgin is more specific to one area, and it's not necessarily carried on for many years. But Creole is when it becomes a distinct dialect, and of course you probably are familiar with Cajun Creole speak because of the proximity of us to Louisiana. But Creole does not exist only in Louisiana. There's also Creole in other parts of the United States, such as areas of South Carolina, near some islands off of the coast. So only Creole is passed on to the next generation. Pidgin is generation specific, meaning that it stays within that generation. It's not passed on from it hasn't passed down over the years. So African American English, I've mentioned before, it's also been known as African American Vernacular in the past, AAV for short. It is spoken by some, but not all African Americans. So we cannot make the assumption that just because someone is of the ethnicity or racial background of being African American, that they are African American English dialect speakers. But it is spoken by some within this culture. Socioeconomic status may influence the use of African American English. So the socioeconomic status is tied or correlated to whether someone is a speaker of AAE. It's very important to note that those who speak may code switch. Last year in October, there was a book called The Hate You Give that came out. A movie, The Hate You Give, that came out in October. The book came out last January or late 2017. It is an excellent depiction of code switching, and because the main character is code switching between her home life where she speaks African American English in her neighborhood and at home, and where she speaks standard American English and predominantly white private school. The author, Angie Thomas, is actually from Jackson, Mississippi, and says a lot. I've listened to her speak, and says a lot of it was based on her own personal experiences as a student and a person growing up in Jackson. So it's an excellent depiction of code switching and how speakers of that dialect, or any dialect really, can switch between those two dialects or three dialects that they speak. We all are code switchers to a certain extent, because the way you will speak to me as your professor is different than the way you're going to speak to your peers in your class. You're going to probably speak to me more formally, just as I am more intentional and more specific about the words I'm using to teach you, rather than if I was speaking informally to my peers, or if I was speaking as a teacher to a young student, I would be speaking to them differently, or even as a parent to my children. We are all code switchers at different times. So, but it is definitely an occurrence of speakers of African American English switching between that and standard American English dialect. Most African American preschoolers speak it, and they start learning the mainstream American English, or MAE, when they enter grade school. And I have been saying standard American English, that is interchangeable with mainstream American English, as far as in reference to the primary dialect spoken in schools, because there is a specific dialect and vocabulary associated with what we're using in schools to speak and to write. Historically, some Southern white people spoke elements of African American English, and you can see the text box in Table 5.1. These are African American English characteristics and mainstream American English statements. Some of the things that you might see in Southern white English are the use of ain't. That is a shared characteristic. There's also sometimes the double negatives. So let me find a specific example. Okay, if you go almost halfway down the text box, you have present tense forms of auxiliary have may be omitted. So I've been here for 2 hours. He done it again. 2 boxes down, you have multiple negatives or double negative use. We don't have no more. I don't never want no cookie. I don't never like broccoli. So there are some shared characteristics between Southern white English and African American English vernacular. Not all of them, but there are some. So as you can see, there are many distinct characteristics of African American English that deviate or are different from mainstream American English. And this is important because when we're looking at children, specifically for language disorders, there are certain grammatical markers, is what they refer to, certain markers for tense, such as past tense and plurals, that we see children in the research with language disorders that they omit these markings, meaning that they don't use plurals, or they don't use past tense. But if you look at African American English, that is also characteristic of that. So he got 2 boxes of apple. She gave me 5 cents instead of 5 cents. So when we're considering children to be disordered, and if we know that that characteristic is predominant in children with language disorders, we need to be aware that that is a specific characteristic of African American English and may not necessarily be indicative of a language disorder. And again, there are various assessment methods that we can use to delineate between a language difference and a language disorder. But that is why it is relevant to the conversation of assessment and assessment of children with speech sound disorders. Given the context of speech sound disorders, if a child is doing final consonant deletion or cluster reduction, then we might still see a child who doesn't have plurals, who might say she gave me 5 cents and not 5 cents, because that's a cluster reduction. So we need to be aware of that and when assessing speech sound disorders, because is it a characteristic of the phonological disorder, meaning they're doing it for all words that have clusters and all words that have final consonants, or are they only doing it specifically for tense marking, such as plurals or past tense? And if it's only specific to those grammar markers, then it's likely a dialectical difference and not a true speech sound disorder. So, there are a few unique phonological features that distinguish African American English from mainstream American English. We have deletion of final nasal or oral stop consonant, consonant cluster reduction, and unstressed syllable reductions. These are specific phonological features, and again, we can see these in children with speech sound disorders. You can find these on table 5.2. So we have R, lessening and omission, and again, we see children with speech sound disorders have difficulty with R. So instead of door, they say do. Instead of mother, they say mutta. Instead of protect, protect. So again, we need to consider, are these deviations in the adult phonological form and the child's form due to dialect, or are they due to an actual disorder? One of the most common ones that I see in the children that I work with, an F voiceless TH substitution and word final or medial positions. So instead of teeth, it's teeth. So both, it's both. I often hear children say they're going to the bathroom and having a birthday party instead of bathroom and birthday party. So that voiceless FTH substitution is very common. I've seen it in adult speakers of African American English, even teachers within school systems. I've heard those dialectical variations. So I think there were about 17 specific phonological or speech deviations or distinctions between African American English and mainstream American English. So children learning African American English may exhibit the monophthongization of diphthongs, saying R for hour. And of course, that's something we also hear in Southern American English. You can have a substitution of T for D for TH and the th and V sounds in prevocalic position, and F, T, and V in intervocalic and postvocalic positions. So again, that's the example I was just giving. Birthday, bathroom, teeth. For voiceless TH, the T substitution, we have, instead of think, I tink that. Instead of thin, it's tin. Again, you can see all of those on table 5.2. You have consonant cluster reductions. Again, that is a characteristic of children with speech sound disorders. So instead of throw, it's though. Instead of desk, it's des. Instead of left, it's left. You have late learning of the voice TH sound, and a relatively early mastery of prevocalic and word initial positions, as well as final positions with clusters, such as So African American English learners follow the same general pattern as mainstream American English learners. Everyone's learning sounds at the same time, and we discussed in the development chapter that we see sounds developed across multiple languages at certain ages. So by age 2, African American children produce commonly occurring English consonants. By age 3.4 to 3.11, African American children master 82% of consonants. By age 5 and 6, they master late learned fricatives. And then final consonant deletions may persist past the 3rd grade. And that's because this could be characteristic of the dialect and not attributable to a speech sound disorder. And we do especially see that in those clusters. So those final consonant clusters where you have 2 consonants together on the ends of words. So that is African American English, and the one that you're going to encounter the most probably in the southern United States. In regards to Native American languages, 1.7% of the population is Native American, which is about 5.2 million people. And in Columbus, you have a closer proximity to the Native American population than I do in southern Mississippi. So I know that there have been students from that population in the W's program before. So 78% live outside their reservation areas, but there are still specific reservation areas in the United States. Again, we have one in Mississippi. There are more of them in certain areas of the United States. I've worked with somebody who was in Wyoming and worked with the reservation population there. Many Native American children live with both non-Native American families. Native American children live with non-Native American families to attend school. Most Native American people speak only English. We have seen an attrition of Native American language over the years, meaning that there are less and less speakers of those native languages. Most Native American languages are spoken only by a few individuals. Many languages are extinct or on the verge of extinction. So, estimates of Native American language families vary between 3 and 30. The American Indian website lists 6 families of Native American languages: the Eskimo Aleut, the Algonquian Wakashan, Nadine, Penutian, Hokansiwan, and Aztec Tanoan. So these are the Native American languages in the United States and variations of them spoken in the United States. Varied spellings are common for some language families, such as Nadine, Algonquian, Algonquian. And I'm not positive I'm saying all of these correctly. I'm doing the best based on my phonological knowledge. So forgive me if I'm not saying those exactly as they are said. So because of their variety, phonological characteristics of Native American languages are poorly understood. We don't have a lot of research on these specific languages. So and the phonological characteristics of Native American languages continue to change. So such as Old Blackfoot has lost the word initial U and P phonemes. Some Native American languages have far fewer sounds than English. Again, we have 42 to 44, 45, depending on which chart you're looking at. The Arawakan language is only 17 phonemes. That's a big difference. That's a lot of phonemes that native speaker must learn to speak English. Nasalized vowels may be found in many Native American languages. And of course, in comparison to English, we only have 3 consonants and no nasalized vowels in American English. There also are differences in meaning that can be signaled by different pitch or tonal quality of vowels. So go back to Chapter 3, supra-segmental features, S-U-P-R-A. Supra-segmental features, that's how we go up and down, and if we're using sarcasm or asking a question or making a statement. And there are differences in Native American languages and mainstream American English. Vowel length may also distinguish meaning. Vowels may be voiceless. That's not something that's characteristic of American English. Glottal stops are more common to many Native American languages. So the glottal stop is when a child has a consonant or a stop sound in the middle of a word. So in children who are American English speakers, let's say this word is water, we're going to hear them say water because they know there's a phoneme that goes there in the middle, and they mark it with that glottal stop, but it's not the true t stop sound that we have in the word water. So water instead of water, and that is actually common to Native American languages. Consonant clusters are few in some languages and may not occur in the syllable final position at all. And again, we have many consonant clusters and final positions in English. And then the p, t, and k may be unaspirated, meaning that we don't aspirate those sounds. They don't aspirate those sounds in Native American language. So research on Native American children's speech sound learning is limited because few children learn their native languages. Again, there's an attrition of these languages. They're not being passed down generation to generation. Few Native American children are bilingual. There were 20% in just one study. Most are monolingual English speakers, meaning they only speak English, but they may have a parent or a grandparent or even a great-grandparent who speaks the Native American language. In one study, 5% of Papago children who spoke English had a speech sound disorder in that language, and that is similar to children with speech sound disorders in mainstream American English. The third dialectical variants that we'll discuss are Spanish language and dialects. So the Hispanic population is it's varying between the second and third largest population in the U.S. So traditionally it's been African Americans, so the second largest population, but the Hispanic population is rapidly growing. So in Mississippi, this would be the second highest dialectical variation that you'll encounter when treating children with speech sound disorders or language disorders. So there are different ethnocultural groups that have Spanish language background. They're referred to as Hispanics, and the term Latinos is interchangeable with Hispanics. The Latinos hail from several North, Central, and South American countries. So you're not, Spanish might be the origin language, but most of these speakers are probably coming from Mexico and Central America and South America, such as Argentina or Peru, the Central American countries like Guatemala or Panama. So there are going to be specific country variations within the speakers of Latino dialects. So Spanish is the shared language, but there'll still be variances within those speakers depending on what area of North, Central, or South America that the speaker is from. So it's 16% of the U.S. population, more than 50 million people. Mexicans are the single biggest group of Latinos or Hispanic dialect speakers. Latinos speak different Spanish dialects. The children in the U.S. may speak English, a variety of Spanish, or both. And I've had many children who speak Spanish as their native language and don't start speaking English until they enter the school population at age 5. So to assess Spanish influenced speech, as a clinician, we need to know the language characteristics of Spanish, and this can be found on table 5.4, and that is on page 231. Okay, so some of the characteristics, there's a frequent devoicing of final consonants and a B for V substitution. So dose, like a medicine dose, becomes dose. And for the word very, they say berry. B for V is a very common, or B for V is a very common substitution in Hispanic children. There are the ch for sh substitution. So churly for the word Shirley. The silent in words starting with H. So old for hold, it for hit. And again, these are features that are native to the Spanish language that are carrying over into that English dialect. The Spanish phonological features may influence English learned as a second language, and the clinician should understand phonological characteristics of Spanish to assess bilingual children's speech patterns. Another common feature of Spanish language is the fronting of the th and th sounds, and fronting of the fricatives s and z. So if you ever see a Spanish speaker, you might see that they have a tongue thrust positioning for the S and Z phonemes and z, and that is a common characteristic of Latino speech. So in American English, we might treat it as a tongue thrust speech sound disorder, but if it's a native Spanish speaker, then it's actually a feature of their dialect. So you can see that near the bottom of the chart on table 5.4, the frontals produce more frontally than in English. And so it looks like a possible frontal lisp sound. I have a good friend who's from Panama originally, and she immigrated when she was 14 years old, and she does not front as distinctly as her mother. Her mother has the open bite posture from fronting that sound all of her life, and she does have the fronting of the sound, but it's more of the tongue positioning for the front phonemes than the open mouth posture that her mother has. So it's something that her whole entire family has and will have for the rest of their lives because their native language was Spanish. So Spanish speech sound patterns, they have a sound system that's simpler than that of English. English has 15 vowels. Spanish has only 5. English has 24 consonants. Spanish has 18. And so for any of you who took Spanish in high school or college, it's a relatively easy language to learn to speak with in regards to phonemes because pretty much in Spanish, it's spelled the way it sounds, whereas English, we have so much variance because we're influenced by so many other languages. The English phonemes are v, th, z, and zh are absent in Spanish. The Spanish consonants of ng and the trilled R, which I cannot do, and some of these other phonemes that I cannot produce, they're absent in English. So that's the niña, that niña. I cannot do a trilled R, so I'm not even going to attempt to do it. And that's another thing, too, as far as native language learners and native language speakers versus a language learner. If you are past the age of 12, you lose the ability to learn a second language and speak it without a dialect. So even if I were to be able to become a fluent speaker of Spanish, which I am not, I would still have an accent as a speaker of that native English. So our native language strongly influences our ability to learn those second languages past a certain age. But if you're prior to the age of 12, someone who is integrated within a second language learning environment very early on, then that child can learn to speak the language without an accent. So you could potentially have a child who speaks Spanish as their first language and learns to speak English immediately as far as immersion in the English culture and comes to school or by the end of junior high speaks English, which is their second language, fluently and with no accent. So many Spanish consonants are also unaspirated sounds. The t and d phonemes, which are apical and aspirated in English, are dentalized and unaspirated in Spanish. So you're not going to aspirate or stop those sounds. And being dentalized means that they're more on the teeth. We produce them on the alveolar ridge, but not Spanish speakers. In Spanish, only s, n, r, ul, and d are produced in word final positions. So many English final consonants may be deleted. And in Spanish, consonant clusters are fewer and simpler. Final clusters are rare, and the initial clusters are absent. English clusters may be reduced to single consonants. And you can see table 5.5 for additional features and examples on page, no, that's not correct because that is actually for Asian speakers. So I'm going to take that out right there. So in regard to, let's talk for a second about those clusters or final the markings in Spanish. So plurality in Spanish is marked in a different way. So in English, we mark plurals with the phoneme. So we have S or ES, and sometimes that sounds like a Z, or it could be course, says, so that S sound, and that's because that's how we mark plurality in English. That plurality in Spanish is not marked with adding an S to the end of words. So usually it's marked by the articles. So la becomes las, lo becomes los. Also, grammatical marking in Spanish is different. So you have the 6 variations of how you mark first person, second person plurals. You end in O or you end in A, so they're using vowels to mark tense, versus in English we're using the D phoneme to the past tense ed to mark past tense and regular past tense words. So those can be things that are difficult for English second language learners to learn when they enter school and they're learning English, but that's not a pattern that they use in their native language of Spanish. Mexican American children have been studied the most. Spanish-speaking children master the basic 5 vowels by 18 months. Most Spanish phonemes are mastered by age 4, similar to English. Cluster reduction and unstressed syllable deletion, stridency deletion, and tap or trill deviations may still be evident by the end of preschool, and the dialectical features may be evident by age 3. Velar and palatal fronting, prevocalic singleton omission, stopping, and assimilation are likely to have disappeared by the end of preschool. So you'll recall that those are phonological processes, phonological patterns. And so just as in English we expect certain patterns to disappear by a certain age, the same thing for Spanish. Errors of the fricatives, affricates, liquids, and consonant clusters may be found during the early elementary years. Generally, phoneme acquisition in monolingual Spanish-speaking children is similar to that in monolingual English-speaking children. Speech sound errors are similar across bilingual and monolingual speaking children, so they share some of the same characteristics across whether you're a single language speaker or a monolingual language speaker. But again, when children are demonstrating some sound errors and they're learning a language that is not their native language with more phonemes and more patterns to learn, we need to be sure that the child, if we're going to identify a speech sound disorder in a Spanish speaker, we need to make sure that they would have these errors in their native Spanish language as well as the English language. If not, it's attributable to dialect difference and not a true disorder. Spanish-English bilingual children at age 4 may make more consonant and vowel errors in English than those who speak only English. And again, that's because they're moving from only 5 vowels to many more. Bilingual children may exhibit a great number of phonological patterns and for longer duration than monolingual English or Spanish-speaking children. So their patterns may persist longer because they're bilingual speakers. Bilingual children from lower socioeconomic status may attain speech sound mastery at a slower rate. So the last dialect we'll speak to are Asian and Pacific Islander languages. So this is a very ethnically and linguistically diverse people. Of course, Asia is a larger continent than we are, so they have more countries and more dialects spoken than we do in the United States. So you can see the text for an overview of Asian languages. Table 5.5 has characteristics of English influenced by Asian languages. Because of the variety, generalizations about Asian speech and language features are inappropriate. So we can't generally say that all Asian speakers are going to have these characteristics like we can as much for African American English or Spanish, native Spanish speakers, because there's just too many languages and Asian speakers to apply that to. Asian children in the U.S. may be bilingual. The U.S. born are likely to be monolingual English speakers. So Asian American English is influenced by the primary Asian language of the speaker. You can see that on table 5.6. The phonological characteristics of Asian languages vary greatly. And this is my typo. 5.5 is the summary, and 5.6 are some of the phonological characteristics. The RL substitution and R omission are two I'd like to point to because those or phonemes, the r phoneme doesn't necessarily exist in many Asian languages. So you'll see them say lies for rise or clown for crown. You also have R omission, so gulp for girl, tone for torn. And again, that's an error that we see persist in children up to age 5 or 6. So if it's an Asian language ethnicity, we need to be sure that if that child's demonstrating that error, that it's not due to their dialect or their first language spoken, or even if they're English as their first language, if they're monolingual English in their home, their parents could still be exhibiting those characteristics of having those speech sound substitutions. So you can reference the text for an overview of Chinese, South Asian, Vietnamese, Hmong, Khmer, Thai, Tagalog, Korean, Japanese, and Arabic languages. Studies on speech sound learning of Asian American children are few because, again, it's so varied and there are so many populations. Generally, children acquire their native Asian languages roughly in the same manner as native English learners. In one study, Cantonese children mastered anterior phonemes before the posterior, stops and glides before fricatives and affricates, which is a similar pattern in English. Phonological patterns of Cantonese children may be similar to those found in English-speaking children. So error patterns in Cantonese, which I believe is one of the most prominent languages in China. It includes cluster reduction, affrication, final consonant deletion, final glide deletion, fronting, backing, and assimilation. There's nothing unique about this. Arabic children generally acquire their phonemes in a manner similar to that found in English-speaking children, with some differences. The b, t, d, k, f, and ul may be acquired earlier in Arabic than in English, and usually when we see phonemes acquired earlier in one language over another, that's because the phoneme is more prominent in that language. The th, th, r, and y may be acquired later in Arabic than in English, and again, that's probably due to the prominence of those phonemes within those specific languages. And that concludes this week's lecture.